You're listening to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. Season ticket holders and lifelong fans with neighborhood ties discuss Cubs news and neighborhood happenings. Here's your hosts, Jeremy and Pat.
Hello and welcome to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. This is episode 349 of the podcast. My name is Jeremy Deemer and I'll be your host. I'm joined as always by my co-host. He's my cousin and he's high atop Wrigleyville tonight. How's it going, Pat?
It's going well, Jeremy. Thanks for asking.
What a week for the Cubs. We've got a lot of news. We've got a lot of talk, speculation, all kinds of fun stuff to unpack. We'll recap the two series that happened since last we podcasted. We'll preview the week ahead, and to help us unpack all things Cubs, you know him from his newsletters and podcasts, Pointless Exercise, his appearances on this podcast as well. Please welcome back Andy Dolan. Andy, thanks for taking time out to talk Cubs with us tonight.
Oh, thanks for having me. Sorry I was a little late. I grabbed my iPad, but apparently Wilson Contreras had smashed it, so I had to find my laptop.
We'll get there. We will talk all about Wilson Contreras and the news of the week. But first, it was a 3-3 week for the Cubs.
Thankfully, question mark.
Could have been worse. Could have been way worse. I had 2-4 in my predictions. You had 3-3 last week. And those two White Sox games, we were talking about it before we hit record, down 5-0. And usually for this Cubs team, you feel out of it, but not against this White Sox team. They were worse than advertised, Andy.
I was impressed at how bad they are. I mean, the record, they were 14-45 coming in, and that's awful. And you're like, all right, well, there's got to be some bad luck. I don't think there's any bad luck. Although, what is their record without Tommy Pham? They were like 3-25 without Pham. And, of course, he had gone on the injured list because he took the world's most circuitous route from third to home when he knew he was going to be out and ran into William Contreras. And
I thought he hurt himself punching the air when he was fake punching.
Yeah, right. Acting like a tough guy. And his weird, it wasn't a press, just getting interviewed at his locker, but they said, that's why I do all that fight training. It's like, so I can, F mother effers up. And it's like, I thought you did it because people are always trying to stab you at strip clubs.
The Cubs hanging on to win both of those games, Pat. It was it could have gone either way, either one of those games, but thank goodness the Cubs needed those two. We were not confident going into the Cincinnati series, and we needed to see the Cubs at least win two. This would have been completely different tone. We're already not thrilled with the performance of the week, but it could have been way worse.
Sure could have, Jeremy. And every 50 years the Cubs do this thing where they fall down to a team by 4 or more runs in back-to-back games, and then they beat that same team. They did it in 75. They did it this week. They haven't done it in between.
I hope this team's as good as those 75 Cubs were.
Yeah. I think that was DeAndre Thornton leading the team with 17 home runs, which may be pretty similar to what we see this year at the rate we're going. But it was nice to see the Cubs come back and win for sure. All kidding aside, they really needed to win these games, and the way they did it the first night, where they came back from 5-0, scored 5 runs, and then promptly gave up a run to fall down 6-5. You kind of got that sinking feeling like, oh boy, they put everything they had into it and it just wasn't enough. But sure enough, they came back in the 8th, got a couple runs thanks to Ian Happ, the reemergence of Ian Happ. Remember that guy? The last couple weeks he's been just occasionally he's like the Forrest Gump of the Cubs lately. Every once in a while he shows up with men on base and get a double and drive in a bunch of runs, and here we are, and game-winning hit.
In that first game, the most infuriating thing was how they gave up. You mentioned they tied it and then gave up a run. They gave up a home run to Luis Robert.
Yes.
With nobody on. Really? You couldn't pitch around the only guy on their team that could do anything? Yeah.
And he had just come off the IL, so like you knew that this happens to the Cubs all the time. Guys get right or get healthy against the Cubs. Yeah, couldn't have pitched around him.
Yeah, it's like, oh, unbelievable.
After getting those 2 victories.
Oh, wait, we haven't gotten to the second victory yet.
Oh, we're going to talk about that one too? Okay.
Yeah, I was there. I have to.
Oh, you were there? That's right.
So it started off poorly when Taillon gives up a home run on the first pitch of the game.
That's right.
Never a good sign. Have you noticed, like, I kind of looked it up afterwards, so I don't want to spoil it, but he has been giving up a lot of base runners this year. Even when he doesn't give up runs, boy, he puts a lot of people on base. And he did it again against the Sox, although he did also give up some runs. And he stopped striking people out. And we should get one of those sabermetrics experts to come on and explain to us if that's good or bad. But I feel like dropping your strikeouts by, 40% and then increasing the people you put on base might not be a recipe long-term anyway for success.
He can ask Hector Neris.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe they were hanging out while he was on the injured list.
This was another game where the Cubs looked like they were gone, and then sure enough, they claw their way back, and they down 5-1. They score 5 runs to take the lead, and then they promptly give up a run to tie the game 6-all. And I thought, well, we'll see. And then in the 9th inning, Mike Tauchman, of course, hits a walk-off home run. After the Cubs, I thought for sure we're going to give up a run in the top of the 9th. Man on second, nobody out. That's a classic telltale run giving up, and picked off a guy at second base, which was nice. But interesting in this game, since we're talking about things that don't happen very often, this was the first time since 1987 when the Cubs have played a game where there was a home run hit on the first pitch and the last pitch of the game.
Wow.
Walk-off homer by Tauchman, obviously, the last pitch of the game. But in 87, it was Bobby Dernier. Now it's Mike Tauchman, both center fielders, so go figure. And, I came away after those 2 games thinking, you know what? This is exactly the type of thing you need when you're playing just a miserable 62 Mets type team. Although I know in 62 the Cubs were responsible for all the Mets wins. But this was a chance for the Cubs against Cincinnati after winning these 2 games to go in there. If they could take 3 out of 4, they could actually, find themselves back in the hunt for the NL Central. And that almost happened, except for the winning the 3 out of 4 part.
Now, the 62 Cubs weren't responsible for all of the Mets wins, just a quarter of them.
A quarter of them, yeah.
They were 9-9 against the worst team in baseball history, and so 9 of the 40 wins for the Mets.
For a team that lost 122 games, for those of you counting at home. And the White Sox are on pace, or have been on pace, to hit that mark. I was worried going into the series that the Cubs would inevitably lose one of the games. I talked about it last week on the podcast. It's really hard to tag a team with its 12th and 13th consecutive losses in back-to-back days. I know it seems like they're a bad team, so you should be able to do that. But everybody in baseball wins eventually. And for the Cubs to be able to do that,
and when they play the Sox, it always feels like they split every time. Yeah. Like the Sox get up for these games more than a lot of the others.
I'm surprised how big. What was the celebration like after the win on Wednesday, though? Because the Cubs, with the win, have already retained the crosstown, the BP.
I know, right?
I mean, was there a champagne celebration on the field?
I saw champagne. I saw people in the stands hugging. I mean,
that's huge.
Yeah, it was about as good as it gets.
So you mentioned that the guy got picked off second base. Well, that was rookie Duke Ellis in his major league debut. And he told a story that I assumed he was kidding, but it sounds like he wasn't kidding. He got called to the manager's office in the minors, and he thought he was being released. And he was told he was being promoted to the White Sox.
Which is like being released.
Exactly. It's like, Duke, would you think that was worse? Would you have rather been released? But how tenuous is your grasp in, not how tenuous, but your confidence? It's like, oh God, I think they're just going to release me. Instead, it's like, hey, congratulations.
My professional baseball career is completely over. Oh wait, no, I'm going to play Major League Baseball. Oh wait, sorry. Who knew?
So I'm sort of going to play Major League Baseball. I'm going to go play for the Lakers.
I'll play against Major League Baseball teams.
And there was a girl that I worked with who told everybody I think of this when he told that story. She told everybody at work that her boyfriend had told her that he needed to talk to her, and she was like, "This is it. He's going to ask me to marry me. We've been, this. I've been giving hints to this guy for a long time. This is going to be great." And the next day, she's late to work, and one of her friends shows up and says, "Do you guys have anything planned to like celebrate Lynn's engagement?" We're like, "What?" And she's like, "Well, she was sure she was gonna." We're like, "Well, no. Why?" "Because he broke up with her."
Oh, brutal.
And it's like, yeah, most of us kind of figured that. But to me, that was Duke. Like, he thought he was getting dumped. Instead, he walked in and he got promoted. Two people that are just, completely clueless, just an opposite.
And then in White Sox fashion, that helped the team lose its 13th consecutive game. Yeah.
He played a critical role. Congratulations.
He did. So what happened in Cincinnati, Jeremy? That's all they had to do. They could have split those two games.
Is all you need to do.
4-2, but no.
They could only salvage one out of the four. The one being, of course, the Imanaga start. Good to see him right the ship. But the other three, close games, but not close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, as they say. And
the Prasad got crunched again, which is, aren't you? I mean, as a Cubs fan and as a realist, when Imanaga and Assad are pitching lights out like this, especially with Assad's, like, his FIP is like way higher than his ERA. You're just kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, where you're like, okay, when's it going to catch up to us here? And I feel like he's starting down that path, which is unfortunate because the Cubs have actually scored a couple of runs lately, but not enough when you give up 8.
No, that was bad. The win was good though. Let's they had, if you had lost 4, you had to win that game. The Cubs had to win that game. If you had lost all 4 to Cincinnati, you're already, looking at where the standings were, you were already in last place with the Cardinals before.
Well, they weren't. They were .001 ahead of the Cardinals. But a loss on Sunday, they'd be instead they're tied for second.
Yeah.
6.5 back after the 1-3 series in Cincinnati. 6.5 back. Cincinnati also 6.5 back. The Cardinals also 6.5 back. And Pittsburgh only 7 back. So all bunched up right behind the Brewers.
Is Imanaga the only All-Star on this team?
That's exactly where I was going with this. Andy,
I don't think Neris is going to make it, right?
Oh God, I hope not.
Could you pick anyone else besides Shota Imanaga to be the Cubs representative for the All-Star?
I could pick Jan Gomes, and let me explain. Do you remember the year when, for whatever reason, some catcher couldn't play in the game, and they called up Joe Girardi, who was the Cubs catcher,
yes,
and he wasn't doing well at all.
Yep.
But they're like, hey, we just need a guy, and we like you, or we know you, or whatever.
Maybe he was in town.
Yeah, pretty much.
He was a car ride away.
Would you be willing to do it? And he's like, oh, are you sure? I feel kind of embarrassed. So like, you can bring your family. He's like, okay. So he did. So that would be a way to get a second player, I suppose. But I don't think they're going to get a position player otherwise, right?
How many times was Joe Girardi an All-Star?
With the Cubs or total?
Ever.
Oof. 3? I don't know.
That time. 2000.
That was it. Okay.
That was it.
He was a manager, I guess, of a couple All-Star games.
Yeah. He ended up hitting 278 that year. But yeah, he was bad. I mean,
kind of an empty 278, I'm guessing.
Yeah. Well, everything Joe did offensively was empty.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, unless Assad has a good June, which he could, and then he might be a candidate. But other than that, Imanaga, who I guess we saw the stat that it was on Twitter. Cub Hub says the Cubs are 10-2 when Shota starts, and 22-32 when he doesn't.
Wow. Camp had that stat. They had no Cub starter had won a game since the 21st of May.
Yeah.
Until Shota did on Sunday.
Not only that, his 11 walks this season are the fewest by any Cub pitcher in the first 12 career starts since 1901.
Yes, Megan Montemuro says, his 72 strikeouts trail only Kerry Wood's 107 in 1998 and Mark Pryor's 86 in 2002 for the most by a Cubs starter through 12 career games started since 1901.
And Wood got 20% of those strikeouts in one game. Just saying.
Kerry Wood's 107. Good Lord. That's 21 more than Pryor.
Yeah.
Good
Lord. But no, all the way around, he's been great.
Absolutely.
I'll give credit where credit is due because I'm going to give some. What do you call when you don't give credit? The opposite. I'm going to give some. I'm going to take some credits away later in the broadcast for Jed, but I'll give him credit for this one. I don't know how he did it. Might have been by accident, like because he's cheap. Who knows? I'll take it. Getting Imanaga on this deal did work out. So good for us. So
I've given this some thought, and obviously Shota will make it, and I would guess that will be they will just wipe their hands of that and go, we got our Cub. But if another guy makes it, given the dearth of talent in the National League outfield, Acuna's gone, Acuna's out, Mookie's a shortstop, second baseman. Other guys aren't having good years. It's really hard to fill an outfield.
Brian Reynolds is down with the Pirates. He'd be a guy, right? Typically.
So would the Cubs' most productive outfielder get picked, especially if teams do that thing where guys get picked and they're like, oh, my back's tight, whatever. You start to go down the list a little bit. Could the Cubs and this would be the best Cub, I think the best Cub all-star since Brian LaHare. Could Mike Tauchman play in the all-star game? He is their best outfielder. Most productive outfielder. Because Cody has been up and down, Say has been hurt, and
where's the game being played
for a week.
Do we know where the game's being played?
Texas, right?
That's right. I'd say if it were in New York, he's a former Yankee, so right, isn't he?
He's a former Yankee. He's also a former Giant. He's a beloved Giant because of one catch he made. Rob Albert Pujols of a walk-off home run in the year that the Giants won 108 games and the Dodgers won 107.
He's good at catching those walk-off home runs. It would just require Suzuki or Happ or Bellinger, three of the most durable players in National League history. It would just require one of them probably to get injured soon so that he could get the requisite number of plate appearances to kind of put himself over the top.
Well, he's got more plate appearances right now than Cody. And he's listed as the right fielder on Baseball Reference for the Cubs.
Well, but if he sits on the bench for the next 4 weeks, that'll hurt his cause.
Yeah, but with this juggernaut offense, he's got to play pretty much every day, one way or the other. Either one of the outfield spots or the DH spot. He's he's a regular. He's going to get plenty of at-bats. So the Palatine Pounder, what is he?
Pounder, I think.
There you go. Make an obvious shirt for that.
If it happens, you heard it here first. So, any other thoughts on the Red Series before we move on?
It's just disappointing when you lose games. Yeah, look, the Cubs pitching wasn't terrible. I mean, other than the first game where they give the 8 runs, if you give up 3, 4, and 2 runs in 3 straight games like that, you could theoretically win all those games against mediocre pitching.
Well, and then Sunday was the rare instance of them actually scoring first in the first inning.
Yeah.
Of course, then they just didn't bother after the second. Oh, we're good. Shota, you can make that hold up. I enjoyed how mad Shota was that he came out of the game in the 7th.
Yeah, I was like, why are they going to leave him in? I saw Tommy John cropping up here. I was like,
he seemed fine until he saw that it was lighter coming in.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden he's like, oh, son of a, whatever the Japanese for son of a bitch is. He was muttering it on his way off the mound.
Did you see the strikeout bow where he struck a guy out, turns around and did a bow to the outfield, like a little bow? That was interesting. That might be a new thing.
He bows every time he gets a new ball from the ump. Is that right?
Yeah.
Every time?
Yeah.
It's like, all right, Shota, we get it.
I think
we love you, buddy, but that's enough.
Some takeaways from the Red Series might be, in addition to Ian Happ coming back to life again for the now a couple weeks in a row, and Suzuki, showed up on Sunday, but Justin Steele didn't look terrible, which was good. Like it seems like he maybe is getting back into at least some form. I don't know if it's last year's form, but a form that's serviceable.
I think one of the big stories was Nico Horner breaking his hand.
Oh, yeah. But he's fine. He just can't play, but they won't put him on the IL.
But he won't go on. They won't put him on the IL. What is happening here? This is infuriating.
Aren't we just... it doesn't even... Not only does it not make me mad anymore, it doesn't surprise me. They do it with every injury. Every time a guy gets hurt in the game, it's, well, we don't think he needs x-rays. It'll be fine. A couple of days later, we'll x-ray him, but we're pretty sure it's just going to be a minimum 10-day on the IL if we need to IL him. And then they x-ray him. It's like, oh, God, his hand's shattered. And we're worried that they'll have to amputate.
Yeah,
not only did they do that, are they not ILing him, they pinch ran him the next day. So if they do put him on the injury list, now that he goes back, they can only backdate it. They have to go to the 6th instead of the 5th.
Right.
Which will make them less likely to do it. That'd be more likely to just play with 25 guys instead.
They'll play without him for like 8 days and then IL him for 2, that's the but maybe they were just looking at their minor league options and thinking, well, we can just play one guy down versus bringing Miles back up, and Madrigal's hurt. You heard that, right? In his first game. And
oh, did I hear that? I did. I have an alarm went off in the house. And confetti.
So that was.
Not that I want a guy to get hurt, but I do want him to be in a position where he can't come back. That's what I want.
Yeah. Well, I don't think you're going to see him anytime soon. Anyway,
I would like to see him never. Would be good. Why wouldn't you just bring Vasquez back?
That would be the call, right? To bring Vasquez.
Right.
Either that, or you could play David Bodie at second base as they did, and then Michael Busch at
second base on the Sunday game as well. Yeah, that's.
So I was like, what the hell? But he only played 18 games at first base in the minors.
Yeah, he was the second baseman.
281 at second base, and I was like, he is the second baseman, but he's not a very good one.
If the Brewers can play Mike Moustakas at second base for half a season, I think the Cubs can play Michael Busch there for a few weeks.
But it's still stop just playing with. You already have a bad bench. Don't make it even shorter than it is. The other thing is, I'm sure we're going to hear he can't make it any worse if he plays, right? That's the thing. Craners love to say that. Remember Kevin McHale in the finals, whatever year that was. He can't make it any worse. Well, he did. It basically ended his career. He played on a broken foot. Yeah. I would guarantee that playing with it means it's going to take longer to heal. So give him 10 days off, add somebody else to the roster, let him get his hand back, and then play him. It doesn't seem that shocking to me.
I still am traumatized by it because they would never let Chris Bryant take time off to heal. Yep. Right. And I swear that really did a number on his career because he was just always hurt and always playing, and they just never would take him out and let him get right. And so it always bothers me when I hear they're going to play through it like that.
Yep. Yeah,
with this team.
And wasn't Bryant the shoulder, which was really his worst injury as a Cub? That was in Cincinnati, I think. So
yeah, that's why I've always been had a lot of admiration for Jimenez, the White Sox, because that guy will get hurt and he'll just take off like a month or two and say, I'm going to make 100% sure I'm up to speed before I get back.
There's somewhere between Bryant and Eloy on the scale.
Yeah.
Well, looking ahead to we'll before we get to the week ahead, let's talk a little bit about the other news. So obviously that's the big news on the injury front, but the big news of the day has been at the time of this recording, all the talk about Wilson Contreras. David Kaplan, of all people, has emerged. Breaking news here. It's
so time relevant too, like this news, right?
It's shocking that as we've been outlining the struggles of the Cubs catching position, both offensively and defensively. So if you're not going to do either, what is it you say you do here? Surprising that as that discourse continues to heat up, we now hear about Wilson Contreras.
Badmouth the catcher from 2 years ago. That ought to do it.
The one, yeah.
I was going to say, you know what's a good scoop when he starts it with, have I ever talked about this before? That's not exactly a piping hot new take when Cap starts it with, have I ever talked about this before?
His sources apparently are so bad. His sources being himself, I guess, are so bad that we talked about this on the podcast. Like that was like this. There's this rumor.
I guarantee you he's got a source because there was no shortage of people in that clubhouse. Most of Philly, not other players, other people who were more than happy to badmouth Wilson Contreras. There was no shortage of that.
This wasn't just a 2022 thing. We started hearing this like 2 years before they got rid of him, and it was always like he's not a great clubhouse guy. That was always the mark against him. Maybe not the specifics of destroying iPads or whatever they claimed he did and stuff, but it was always that he's too volatile and he gets too upset. Usually at himself, by the way, from the sound of it, but
it was shocking because on the field he would always keep his composure so well. It was one of those where they talk about it's like, well, of course he's that way. We could see it in public. Of course we know he's doing that, and it's to me it makes it even worse if this is really as I'm sure it's true at least to some extent that they didn't move him like in 2019 or 2020.
Yeah.
Right. If that was, when he was productive, he was an all-star. There clearly would be people who would be interested in him, and they kept him because he was by far their best option at catcher.
He was the best offensive player.
And then they just hung on to him forever, and then they let him go for basically nothing.
Yeah, if they really felt that way, they would have traded him at the trade deadline in 2022 when they were trying to trade anybody they could.
He should have gone in 21 when they traded. He could have been the one guy that they didn't wait until the last freaking day to trade, so you could get a better return.
Was it 22 when they could have got at least traded for a couple months to somebody, and by all accounts he was going to be traded, and then shockingly he wasn't.
He was going to be traded to the Astros.
And then all the Jed stands on social media said, "Oh, of course, this is 7-dimensional chess Jed's playing. He's going to get a compensatory pick with the 68th pick in the draft, and that's way better than anything you could get in a trade. This is going to work out great for the Cubs, And they drafted a guy who had already had Tommy John surgery. He's just now playing. Whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is, that's not true. That's not what you do with an all-star catcher. You don't get a 68th pick in the draft as your compensation. That's nonsense. So it either was a pressing need and they're just really bad at baseball and couldn't trade him, or it's just sort of one of those apocryphal things that gets worse over time after the fact because they have to justify why they replaced him with a 36-year-old catcher and a rookie, neither of whom seemed to be, able to not only hit, which was always but the big issue was the defense, right? It was always Contreras. At first it was Contreras. It wasn't that he broke iPads. It was that he was a bad pitch framer or that he didn't have the intangible pitching qualities that we can't really identify or count, but just trust us.
Yeah.
And then you're looking at the catchers now who couldn't throw. They'd be lucky to throw one of us out at second base. And don't seem to be good pitch framers either. And now you're like, okay, well then which is it? Because at least Contreras had an OPS over like 390 or whatever we're looking at with these guys. So I feel a lot of that was sort of like manufactured after the fact stuff. And maybe he was volatile and maybe he was a guy with more vigor than they'd hoped for. But this team feels like half the time they could use somebody with a little bit of vigor. And what I would say to this allegation that Haw made today is if really
Kaplan,
sorry. Oh, my bad. Wrong day. What I would say to the Kaplan story, though, is if in fact they were mad that he was doing things like breaking other people's iPads, what did David Ross do about it? Did he go up to him and say, hey, stop breaking other people's iPads? Or did they do nothing? Because if they did nothing, shame on them. If they did, then did they fine him? Did they make him pay for new ones? Did they say, look, if you do this, we're going to suspend you because you can't break other people's stuff? I mean, this is sort of like what I was basically like, almost like an HR management technique. Like you can't do that. And if you do, you're going to have to pay a price for it. But I don't remember any of that happening. So really, what's what's the real deal? What's the truth here?
And it was a poorly kept secret that Ross and Wilson didn't get along when Ross came back to be the manager, and a lot of it was Ross. Ross never liked Wilson because Wilson showed up in 2016 and took a big hunk of his playing time away from him because he was better. And from what it sounds like, the problems were worse after Ross. They were less so with Joe, even though Joe ran, the loosest clubhouse around. I have a feeling Wilson was, he was being antagonized and was acting out. It's none of it. I can just say this. I heard that story and I kind of laughed at it. I thought, well, it seems kind of obvious that he would be like that. And I don't care because it doesn't, if the Cubs are in hindsight now trying to, try to whitewash how poorly they handled the catching thing over the last few years. It does, and none of this explains why you didn't trade him, years before he got to free agency. And it also doesn't change the way they bundled the current catching situation, where they have a 36-year-old catcher who the wheels were going to fall off of. Who's always been a journeyman anyway. Yeah. And then your only other catcher is a guy who played 60 minor league games over the course of 3 years because he was always hurt, that you brought up last year and had him be your third catcher for a lot of it before he became your second catcher. You didn't get any of that development time in the minors, and who is now out of options because twice they had to option him to the 60-day injured list to open a 40-man spot. So they can't send him down. They basically are, Miguel Amaya has to be completely developed in the big leagues because they so screwed everything up last year and this year. It's all their fault.
This gets to if I weren't so lazy, think piece I would have written, but I'll just do it as a talk piece. My biggest gripe, I think, with the Hoyer sort of era, if you want to call it that, with the Cubs, is not that he got rid of players that we all like and, core players. It's what he did in lieu of them, right? So you get rid of somebody who you're paying $15 million to. Now what are you doing? Giving it to Drew Smiley? I don't know. Giving it to Yan Gomes? Like you can get rid of Brian and Rizzo and Baez and Contreras and Darvish and Schwarber and all these guys. Get rid of them all. Fine. Do it. Get rid of them all. But don't give me, Patrick Wisdom and Frank Schwindel and Miles Mastroboni and Nick Madrigal and say, see, well, that's that's best we can do. I mean, that's not how it works, guys. Like if you're going to get rid of guys, you got to replace them. And I guess the thing that kind of struck me just today when I was thinking about it was that, I'm looking at the Cubs' current core, and there's been a lot of discussion lately about whether the current core is good enough to be like a core that could help you win a championship or a division or any of that other stuff. And so I was doing a comparison between the last core and the current core. So when the Cubs got rid of Kyle Schwarber, he was 27 years old. They got rid of Baez, he was 28. Bryant was 29. Contreras was 30. Rizzo was 31. Darvish was 33. Those are the ages they were the day the Cubs said, you know what, you're out of here. So I was looking at our current core of these young core we have. Nico Horner is also 27, just like Kyle Schwarber was. Then I saw, well, Bellinger's about to turn 29. Happ's about to turn 30. Suzuki is going to turn 30 any day. Swanson's already 30. And to Andy's point earlier, Mike Tauchman is 33. He's the same age Darvish was when the Cubs got rid of Darvish. And he's our bright young player. And I'm like, this core is as old as the core the Cubs had before or older. And if they don't win this year, then next year when they're all 1 year older than this, like, what does that mean? Like, the whole point of getting rid of the last guys was, well, we don't want to pay them because they're at that age where they're not going to be good. And we feel like we've run a course and they had their time. And now I look at the current group that they've assembled in their place that I think objectively are not as good as what the guys who they got rid of on the day they got rid of them. And I'm thinking all these guys are locked in. You're paying them all money, no trade contracts for half of them. And they're all like basically almost 30 or already 30. And so you really got to, and this gets back to the point we've made in the preseason, which is unless you add an all-star to this team to kind of push these guys down in importance in your lineup, these guys aren't going to carry you to a championship. They can't even beat the Brewers. So, to me, that's kind of a fail as I see it. But I could be wrong. Sorry, that's my rant.
No, it's spot on. It's the lack of superstars, the lack of those top tier players. You've got a bunch of the way the roster is constructed. It's a bunch of mid tier players that you hope will all get hot and exceed their expectations all at the same time. Everyone's going to take a step forward at the same time, and there's a lot of hope around this roster that we haven't seen come to fruition.
A player could have their best season in their age 31 season. They could. But it's less likely than having it in your age 26 or 27 or 28 seasons. And that's what they're going to be counting on next year with all these guys, right?
So Andy, do you see this team, depending on how the rest of this month plays out, right? Being a team that goes out and tries to add a superstar player to try to make a run at the deadline. Time is a factor, like Pat was just laying out there. Is this the year they try to make a move to go for it? Or do they feel that now there's just too many teams and it's too far, if they don't make significant, if they aren't within a handful of games of the Brewers, do they, or a couple of teams in the wild card, do they just not add and hold pat here? How do you think this plays out?
Well, it's funny when at the Cub convention, when they were touting their wonderful roster without Cody, because he hadn't come back yet, Tom Ricketts was quick to say they only won one game less than the Diamondbacks, who won to the World Series. In the last 2 years, you've had a third wild card make it to the World Series, which it's going to be awful hard to sell. You try to sell it to the fans in January, but you won't do it again in July. That all we got to do is get in, and if we add one really good player, we might be able to do some damage. It doesn't feel very Jed to do that, and we've never, but at some point, Jed's got to be a little worried that he might need to do that. This team was supposed to win, and nobody thought this is the issue you have when you build an 85 win team, because you think that's what it's going to take to get into the playoffs. If you have injuries and a couple of guys underachieve, you have like a 78 win team, where if you try to build a 95 win team and a couple of guys have injuries, or you have you'd end up with more depth. You win 88 games, you still make the playoffs, and then you figure it out in the playoffs. So you purposely gave yourself a very thin margin. So you're going to, you would think you were going to have to try to make a move to add a bat to this team. And the smart move would be to try to add somebody who isn't just a 1 year and gone player. And that means, you're going to have to trade more from your precious farm system. But are we always told that's why you have that precious farm system? Some guys you're going to play, and some guys you're going to trade to get players. Well,
that's what the Dodgers do.
Yeah.
That's what the Dodgers do.
That's how we got Jose Quas.
So the two names that are being talked about a lot, we talked about it last year's trade deadline. We wanted to see the Cubs make a move to trade for Pete Alonso from the Mets when the Mets were doing their fire sale last year.
Because the Cubs desperately have needed a left-handed power hitter since they cut, with no compensation in return, their 27-year-old left-handed power hitter.
So he's a name that's resurfaced again as a potential trade target, along with Vlad Guerrero Jr. from Toronto, another name that's been bantied about as Toronto is fallen behind in the wild card race there as well. So those are two names. Would either of those names, Andy, get you excited for a Cubs move?
Well, I mean, Vlad certainly would, given that I don't believe he's a free agent, right? You get him for at least another year. Heat would be, you'd have to try to sign him, which probably feels more the Cubs' speed, right? Get the guy.
Tried to sign him and got outbid.
Yep. We made such an effort. We just,
He's 2 years younger than Nico Horner, by the way.
Yeah.
So if you want to have an actual young person in your core, that's kind of a nice idea.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you wouldn't, you would take either guy. I question and we'll see, things could change. Whether the Blue Jays really would do that or they really would trade Vlad. I know they think they have the same record as the Cubs, although they play in the opposite division. They play in the really good division where that buries you, and it's tougher to get a wild card in the American League than it is in the National League, where they're just kind of handing them out at the door. Because the Cubs are technically, aren't they tied for the third wild card spot right now?
Yes, that is
with
correct.
The Reds and the Giants.
Well, with everyone, yeah.
Everyone.
I guess they're not tied with the Reds because the Reds have just like last year, the Cubs are going to somehow go down to the wire with the tiebreaker against nobody, but they still could. But you've got to do something, and like you alluded to the fact that because they've been handing out no trades left and right, this team really begs for a trade where you trade prospects and veterans to get somebody. And they've tied their own hands. They can't trade Happ. They can't trade Seiya. They can't trade Dansby. And
Bellinger, really. I mean, I don't know what you'd say about that.
Yeah, I don't know how tradable he is with the $30 million option for next year. Some teams might be afraid that he would pick it up, and that would cut his value.
Cubs being one of them, but yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's obviously they need to do something. And here's the good thing, because they're so milquetoast in talent, they could basically improve at almost any position. Correct. So Jed's options he has a multitude of options because he doesn't have anybody any damn good at almost any of his spots. He can upgrade everywhere.
And the beauty of it is by not upgrading last year in the offseason at catcher, third base, DH, I don't know if you call first base an upgrade, but I guess a little bit. They've got like some of the positions where you usually have the biggest bats, right? Like first and third and DH. I mean, and so they could play around with that pretty easily.
Yeah, In a way, their ineptitude makes it easier for them to get an impact bat because they have such little production at, like you said, 3 areas where you typically can find a big bat. And most contenders can't because they've got a guy there already. Well, the Cubs don't.
Right. And you could even upgrade at right field if you really thought, well, Suzuki will be the DH, and then Bush will be your second baseman, and Bellinger will play first, and PCA will play center field, or some combination of all those things.
Yeah, I mean, you can move guys around, so you really can't. You should be able to basically add anybody. That doesn't mean they're going to add anybody, but you could move the pieces around and accommodate any really good player that Jed might be able to get his hot little hands on.
And in reality, if you look at the farm system that we have lauded, or has been lauded, a lot of those guys are corner outfielders. Well, the Cubs are kind of corner outfielded out. I mean, if there's, in the sense that they're not going to bench Happ or Suzuki for Canario or for any of these, young outfield prospects, I don't think. Not when you've got a couple more years on their contracts.
It's almost like either they didn't have confidence in these young guys, or Jed, maybe do they not? Are they the only team that doesn't have like the whiteboard with the magnets with all the players, your depth chart over there? When they signed Happ for 3 years and gave him a no trade, and then they could have looked and seen that like Owen Casey might need to play in that spot at some point. Like Kevin Alcantara might come up, and if you had him and Pete, one of those guys would need to play left field. It's almost like they didn't. They just it's. I don't want to be a skeptic, but it's almost like they offered Happ a contract, and he said yes, and they were like, okay, cool. We don't have to worry about left field for 3 years. And then they looked at finally somebody took their money. They're like, oh, this is great. Somebody finally settled for a mediocre offer. Well, I think we see when he plays why he settled for that mediocre offer. But yeah, they have managed to, if the prospects are as good as everybody says, and there never are. I mean, every team's prospects are overhyped to some degree. They've made it so they've muted the impact those guys can have on the team because you've got established, well-paid players who are in their way. Congratulations.
And heaven forbid Brendan Davis stay healthy. Then what do you do with them? That's the problem, right? You got Owen Cassie. You've got a bunch of guys who are like in AAA, and you got to you got to do something with him. Got to play him.
So even with Hap's resurgence, I wrote a thing for today where I basically, if I was Craig Counsell, I would talk to Hap and I would give him one of two options, which is either we've given you 11 years in our system to prove you can switch hit, and you haven't proven it. You are useless as a right-handed batter. So either you're going to start batting left-handed against lefties, or you're just not going to play. And then you would bring up Canario or Brennan Davis, and they'd become his platoon partner.
Yep.
Which would be especially easy right now if you had to put Nico on the injured list. But you know they would never do that. Because, I don't know, because he seems like a nice guy, and he's got a podcast and coffee and hair plugs, and why we can't mess with Ian? He's one of the good ones.
He's their best hitter in their eyes, probably, right?
And if they really think that it would just prove their hitting evaluation is what we expect. If they really truly think he's their best hitter.
Well, who on the current team is a better hitter?
Well, Cody's a better hitter.
Oh, besides Cody, yeah. Besides Cody, but
I think Seiya's a better hitter. Seiya's a more productive hitter.
He should be, yeah.
So he's not even there. He's third out of their three outfielders.
But he's also I guess he's probably the most consistent, sadly, because Bellinger's been up and down. I mean, over the last, say, 4 years or whatever. Well,
but if his chart for the last few years is heading in the wrong direction pretty hard. Yeah. He's never going to come. What's he slugging right now? He's slugging
376.
376.
And that's after he
be
hit four home runs.
Right. He had to surge to get to that. Yeah. He used to be a guy who could reliably slug 500. And you're like, all right, that's really good. When they still had the pipe dream that he could be a second baseman or a center fielder, the slugging, even with the huge amount of strikeouts, was appealing. Well, then he ended up, he can't handle second. He can't handle center. He can go to left. And they move him to left full time to give him the job. It's undisputed. He has the worst 2021 in baseball until the trade deadline. And then when everybody goes away, he starts to hit. But right now he's a hitter. He's never going to sniff 500 as slugging again. The guy that they thought they were getting when they signed, they're never going to get. They're going to get this, which is a guy who still strikes out too much, but walks
a lot.
And now isn't even a reliable 20 home run hitter. What, he hit 17 last year? Yeah. There's not much there. And you've plugged up a spot that should be easy to put an offensive player in, like Christopher Morel. You should be able to plug him into left, play a real third baseman at third base, but you can't because you got Hap and you've got him, and you can't even move him if you wanted to.
And that seems to be the dilemma they have. They've acquired and then given no trade clauses and $15 to $20 million to a bunch of guys who are ever so slightly above average, league average, right, as hitters, in positions where you need your best hitters.
Yeah.
And he's one of those guys. Like, did he sell out his power so he could increase his on-base percentage? I have no idea. But it seems like
I'd rather have that.
Yeah.
I'd say we'll go back to that then. That was more valuable to us than this is. So go do that again. I don't think you can.
Looking ahead to the week that will be for the Cubs. At Tampa Bay for 3 games. The Tampa Bay Rays for 3 games. 5:50 Central Time start times on those games. And then
so you can go, if the people in Tampa can go to dinner at 4:00 and then they can go to the game.
And go to bed, right?
Yeah.
And then at home for the Cardinals, 3 games with the rainouts earlier in the season. This is it feels like it's been a while. Only 1 Cardinals game so far this year. So 3 at home against the Cardinals, 3 at Tampa Bay. The Tampa Bay pitching matchups here: Tyone for the Cubs on Tuesday, Assad on Wednesday, and Steele on Thursday. Looking for some predictions. Pat, we'll start with you on predictions. 6 games this week.
Yeah, first of all, let me just say the Cubs do need, and I think Andy noted this, the Cubs do need to get some tiebreakers going because they don't have it against the Padres. That's done, right? They've lost that. That's exactly the kind of team that they're going to be fighting for a tiebreaker spot. They don't have it against the Braves. They got lucky and got to play the Braves with Acuna as opposed to without him, sadly.
Yeah.
And if the Braves, just kind of muddle along and the Cubs somehow were able to catch them, they have to more than catch them. They have to beat them, right? and they're 0-2 against the Cardinals so far. So you got to be careful. You can't go 0-5 or 1-4. And they've had failures against Cincinnati and Pittsburgh, and at some point you have to actually have a better record than some of these teams. So it is important that the Cubs win at least 2 out of 3 in that series just to get within 1 game of the Cardinals on the season. But they have to start off with Tampa, and as uninspiring as Tampa looks usually, and their pitchers look, Bradley's actually probably better than we think, or better than most Cubs fans understand, and effing, and I don't know. They missed Sonny Gray, I guess, in St. Louis, hopefully, so that's good. So I'm going to say the Cubs kind of rebound a little bit here with Suzuki and Happ now in full stride, and they managed to go 3-3. Even though the Cubs pitching matchups on their own side are not so sweet this time. They've got Teon pitching twice, Brown, they've got Assad Steele and Imanaga once. That scares me a little bit, but 3-3 I think is my prediction again.
Andy, what do you think?
Well, Tyon going twice though against teams with losing records is right up his alley. He's only beaten 2 teams with a losing record ever as a Cub. Ever. A year and a half of pitching for the team. He's beaten a winning team twice. The Reds last year and the Padres. That's it so far. I was gonna say 3-3 because even though I think Tampa is bad, especially for them, it's such a weird arc and it looks bad on TV. I can see them going 1-2. I do think the Cardinals are bad. I don't think I know there's still a lot of Cub fans who are like afraid that the Cardinals have figured it out and they're going to start getting guys back. I just don't think it's a very good team. So I think the Cubs should win 2 or 3 against them at home. So I'd have them go 3-3.
I think so as well. I think 1-2 in Tampa. That's never an easy trip for anybody. And then 2-1 at home against the Cardinals, starting a homestand after the Cardinals. You'll have the Giants and the Mets. So those are
7 games against the Giants in like 10 days. Like Pat said, could be big at the end of the year because that's a team. The Cubs and the Giants are kind of the same team. And you could very well end up with the same record at the end of the year, stuck there, trying to figure out, if you can get that 3rd wild card spot. And you're going to want to win 4 of those games just to make sure that you get it if you tie.
And the Cubs have to get hot at some point. And I think we talked about how they played just a ton of teams under 500 starting, well, not this week, but starting last week. After Milwaukee, they had a stretch of teams under 500, including 7 against Cincinnati. Well, that unfortunately turned out to be a 2-5 stretch. The 2 White Sox games, the Tampa's under 500, St. Louis is. Giants are just under. The Mets are bad. The Giants again. All those, so you got to make up some ground then, right? Because that's always the thing. We've got that stretch of like 21 games against under 500 teams before you play the Brewers for the second to last time this year in June, at the end of June. Now, Andy, did you realize the Cubs don't play the Brewers after the trade deadline?
Yeah, and they also don't play do they play the Cardinals after the trade deadline? That ends really early this year too.
They have the Cardinals that first series in August, so August 1st and 4th.
Yeah. And I think July 25th or 6th is the last time they play the Brewers. So they have a whole week after they'll stop playing the Brewers before the trade deadline. And that's another reason why, you fall like if you're 9 games out of the Brewers at the trade deadline, it feels like a much more insurmountable mountain when you don't even get to play them head to head at all the rest of the year.
Yeah. The good news is, given when you look around this league, I don't know how bad they'd have to play to be out of the wild card race.
Right, and that.
I mean, you can't play bad enough to fall out of it. I don't think.
So it really tests the theory that. Remember when Theo would say, you just want a lottery. Basically, the playoff spot is a lottery ticket. Once you get in, and Jed pointed out the Arizona. I don't think that's exactly what Theo had in mind when he was talking about that. Because they didn't have 3. I mean, back then you had the 14.
You had to have a better team to get in the playoffs. Yeah, so
you did.
In Theo's mind, if you made the playoffs, you probably were good enough to have a shot, and you
were like a 90-win team, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was the theory.
That's
now you can be like an 82-win team and make the playoffs. The Cubs do have a couple pitchers who, if they're pitching well at the right time, starters, that would be nice. do they have the bullpen and the power? Because in the playoffs, it's nice to have some power, but probably not. But you're right to the point that it's going to be an interesting trade deadline because Jed's going to be in a position of A, not wanting to miss the playoffs, but B, not wanting to pay for anybody.
Yeah.
And they don't. Their margin of error for making a playoff spot is gone pretty much at this point. So they've got to get better in order to do it.
Yeah, and his shopping list, if they decide they're going to go for it, is pretty long, right? He needs a closer. He needs at least another bullpen arm. He needs an impact bat because they don't really have one. And he's going to need to shore up the bench. He's going to need to find a middle infielder somewhere because they, I like the idea that this is the marquee has been out. This is David Bodie's second chance. It's like, isn't this like David's eighth chance?
I mean, he signed a 5-year deal.
Like, we know how this ends for Bodie, right? At some point in June or July, he gets DFA'd again.
Yeah.
And he probably clears waivers because still he's got $3 million owed this year. Nobody wants it. And he goes back to Iowa one more time. I mean,
this is why putting Horner on the IL and bringing up Luis Vasquez actually makes some sense because let the kid play a couple games and see
find out what
you have there,
So they let him bat once and pinch run once, right?
Yeah.
And he that was when Trevor McGill got nailed in the elbow, right? And he was smart enough to keep running and he scored.
Yeah.
So he's already done one more smart thing in the big leagues than Bodie ever has. And he was only around for 2 games.
Or Madrigal or Mastroboni.
Well, Madrigal, that's what I'd say. Nick would have run he would have taken a right turn at third and ended up in the loss down there by the sausage race. It would have just been
The way we end the show every week here is we take a trip to visit the 1984 Cubs as we celebrate the 40th anniversary of that playoff team. We look at what was going on this week in 1984, and we juxtapose it with what's going on here in 2024. So let's take a trip back to 1984. Pat, what was going on with those Cubs?
Sure. Well, this will be a fairly short one compared to the last couple of weeks when we've had some really good stuff. And next week will be a very big one because it's one of the most seminal weeks in Cubs 1980s history, probably. But this week, the Cubs went 3-3. They started the week 2 games above the rest of the teams in the National League East. They finished the week 1 game above, still in first place. They're on the road in Montreal and St. Louis. And if you've ever not had a chance to go to a Montreal Expos game, I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun. I got a chance to do it once and had a blast. You might need a time machine or an expansion franchise to do it, but it's a great trip if you ever get a chance. And so Cubs were 3-3. We saw, so a couple weeks ago we talked about how the Cubs had just acquired Dennis Eckersley to go with Scott Sanderson and Steve Trout and sort of started to build the semblance of a pitching rotation. They had 3 starters now they could rely on. But at this point, this week, they were still relying a lot on Chuck Rainey, who famously almost threw a no-hitter the year before that Eddie Milner destroyed with 2 outs in the 9th. And then Rick Russell, who the Cubs had reacquired and who had been injured and was really struggling at this point of the season. He had a couple good starts early, but this week he had lost a really rough game. This is foreshadowing, by the way, for next week, just so everybody can pay attention. But the Cubs really needed another starter, I think was obvious from this. They did have one interesting game this week. June 10th, today, 40 years ago, the Cubs beat the Cardinals. It was a Sunday, beat them 2-0. The funny part was how the Cubs scored their 2 runs. They scored the first run when Ryan Sandberg, with the bases loaded, facing Joaquin Andahar, tough pitcher for the Cardinals, was hit by a pitch to drive in the first run. Get an RBI for that, by the way. So the future MVP drove in a run. And then in the 9th inning, the Cubs scored an insurance run on what I would say might be one of the more improbable plays in Cubs history. You don't see this anymore. The Cubs called, with the bases loaded, Cubs called for the old triple steal. Larry Boa stole second. Jody Davis stole third. And Leon Durham stole home. And the Cubs got a second run. And that was just enough. That's all they needed for Lee Smith to shut the door and for the Cubs to bring home the win. And instead of having a 2-4 week, managed to have a 3-3 week and stay in first place. So that was this week 40 years ago.
Excellent.
I know what happens next week.
Yeah.
I won't spoil it.
Don't spoil it.
Let's just say the trade deadline was a lot earlier in 1984 than it is in 2024.
It was a lot of fun. I remember where I was when that happened. So that's this week in Cubs. Still in first place.
Excellent. All right.
Which is more than you can say for our current situation, I guess. Still in first place, but still, interestingly enough, and this is kind of the funny part, I guess they were 8 games over 500. So not, they were that's pretty good, I think. They're 32-24 at this point.
I'm looking forward to next week. Big week in 1984 Cubs history. We'll do that every single week here on the podcast. So make sure you stay subscribed. Don't miss an episode here. And with that, we're going to wrap it up this week. Andy, thank you for coming on to talk Cubs with us. Please remind our listeners where they can find your work on the internet.
You can find both the newsletter and the podcast at pointlessexercise.com.
And you can follow us on all of the social media platforms at Wrigleyville Nat. That's Twitter, X, Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram. We're on all those things. Make sure that you're subscribed to the podcast. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're available. Go to youtube.com, search for Wrigleyville Nation Podcast. Give us the like, subscribe, all that stuff over there. Helps us work the algorithm so other Cub fans can find the show. And we appreciate all your support. Easy, free way to support the show there. If you want to support the show financially, you can be one of our patrons over at patreon.com/Wrigleyville Nation. That is how we stay ad-free every single year. It's because our patrons give us enough money to keep the lights on, pay for our hosting fees, pay for our domain names, mic cables, everything. We appreciate it. Every single penny goes right back into the show. All kinds of fun stuff over there at the Patreon, patreon.com/Wrigleyville Nation. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. We're going to call it a podcast. Pat, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks again, everyone, for listening. We'll talk to you again next time.